So the Virginia Festival of the Book is a program of Virginia Humanities, a statewide organization whose mission is to connect people and ideas to explore the human experience. Just to start out with a thank you to our premier sponsor, the Joseph and Robert Cornell Memorial Foundation. Thank you for your support in helping put this on. Most of these events are free, but they are not free to put on. And if you feel so moved, please offer a contribution. You can do it through text. If you text VA Book, all lowercase, one word, to 56651. Or there are some QR codes around the room that you can also access a donation site that way. And speaking of QR codes, the festival organizers really wanted me to remind you that there are surveys that helps us put on good events year after year. Probably also helps with funding. And you can also access those through the QR codes at the end. Last couple notes, if you've got your cell phones, just double check to make sure they're silent. And as always, be aware of your surroundings. There's some exits over there, there's some exits over there. This is an old building, so I imagine in case of emergency, oxygen masks will not drop from the ceiling. And finally, we have some books for sale. If you don't already have copies of Lucinda's wonderful novels, you can purchase them, and she'll be signing them afterward in the beautiful room over there to your right. So without further ado, it is my honor to introduce Lucinda Roy. She is a novelist, poet, and memoirist, and her latest book is the speculative novel Flying the Coop. It is book 2 in the Greenberg Chronicles. The first one is The Freedom Race. So in Flying the Coop, Roy explores a future world where racial conflict and the urban-rural divide have turned the country into the disunited states. This is her 8th book, I believe. 8 books. Among the others are her memoir, No Right to Remain Silent, What We've Learned from the Tragedy at Virginia Tech, the novel Lady Moses, and the poetry collection The Hummingbirds, which was the winner of the 8th Mountain Poetry Prize, judged by none other than Lucille Clifton. She is a distinguished professor at Virginia Tech, and she gives keynotes and presentations around the country on creative writing, race and racism, diversity, and campus safety. Her commentaries and poetry have been published in USA Today and the New York Times. Flying the Coop received a starred review from Booklist. They called it an essential read. So you've heard enough from me. I've talked for a while. I'm going to turn it over to Lucinda. Perhaps she can tell you a little bit about the trilogy and read from both books for about 10 or 15 minutes. Again, this is a casual conversation. So after she reads, I'm going to ask a couple questions. And if you want to jump in at any time, just stick your hand up in the air. The volunteers will come around with a microphone. And you know, I've got plenty of questions, but I'd love to hear from you guys. So thank you, Lucinda, for being with us.
Thank you, Sarah. Is my mic on? Can you hear me? It doesn't seem to be very well. Don't know that it's on.
It's very quiet.
Well, yeah, don't know if it's on. Let it go.
You want to just use this one?
Okay, that's better, isn't it? Yes. Now you can hear me. Okay. And welcome everybody, and welcome people at home who are watching. I'm Lucinda Roy, as Sarah said. Sarah, thank you so much for that introduction. And also thank you to the Virginia Festival of the Book. I'm thrilled to be here. As you can probably hear, my accent is not from Virginia. I was raised in London, and my father was Jamaican, mother British. And so I grew up as a biracial child at a time when it was not fashionable to be biracial at all. So I think I developed a very strong armor because of that. I'm here to talk about the books, the trilogy that I'm working on. I'm working on the 3rd book right now, which is called The Bird Tribe. I would advise anyone who's thinking about writing a trilogy not to do it. There are all kinds of reasons why I would say that, not least the fact that if you are teaching full-time at Virginia Tech, it is an insane thing to do. I was just saying that my children's book was accepted last year too for publication, and it's my first children's book. I'll be illustrating it, as you can see from the big blow-up of my face behind me, which is actually quite embarrassing. And you can see that I paint, so that's one of my paintings behind me. They're large oil paintings, and they're 3 foot by 4 foot. So you would think that it would be easy to be an illustrator, but I haven't worked in things smaller than 3 foot by 4 foot, so it's really going to be interesting to see how that works out. But I can't wait to do it. It's a story about a young black child who loses someone very dear to her, and how she finds joy again, which seems to me to be the most important journey we ever make in our lives, is the journey towards joy. I was trying to think about what to read today, and I don't know why it didn't occur to me before, but much of the freedom race is set in a place called Monticello.
Oh.
Yes, exactly. Well done, I recognize that. And the people who live there are called cellists. And it is incredibly, this is in the future, and everything's got a pot. And this is the middle part of the country, the middle of the South has become very segregated, and it's called the Homestead Territories, and they import labor from Africa, and they have reclassified them as botanicals or seeds. It was brilliant that they decided to do that, because it meant that people had no legal rights whatsoever. And you're either called a mule seed if you're a mulatto, as I would have been classified, biracial, or you're called a common seed if your genealogy is really African American, but you didn't have the papers to prove that you've been here long enough not to be a seed. All kinds of clever things. And there's also seeds called server seeds, and those are the lowest of the low, supposedly, and they are classified as outcasts. And it's a whole labor system because there's been a severe labor shortage because of meta-flu pandemics. It's funny because I wrote all this before COVID, I wrote all this before January 6th. It's actually very nerve-wracking to see some of the things that are coming to pass. But in many ways, one of the things that kind of drives this whole novel is the whole idea of what we can do if we believe enough in ourselves and also in the stories we've been told, how we can create, in a sense, our own reality. So this passage, very short passage from the first book I'm going to read, is from The Freedom Race, and it's when Jelly Bean Lottermule, who is the mule seed, who is been raised on a planting, they're not called plantations, they're called plantings, comes to Monticello, and she thinks about Jefferson. She has been educated. There's something called a legacy school on her planting, so she does have some education. And she's just arrived from the Salem outpost and made the journey. Apart from the Salem outpost, the Monticello Protectorate was the only place in the margins, the center of the country, where botanicals had the right to petition for status as wild seeds. Zyla Klobuchar, her teacher, had told Gigi about Monticello, how it served as an important symbol for the various governing bodies of the fractured nation. The homesteader secessionists saw Jefferson as a model patriarch, a beneficent owner of botanicals who believed in his God-given superiority, owned hundreds of seeds, and sowed his own seed among them. The reunionists in the eastern and western superstates were equally loyal to the founding father, viewing him as the man whose lofty principles made impossible unions possible. The independents, those urban independents, admired him too because of his bold arguments for liberty. Gigi had told her teacher it proved that you could please all of the people all of the time after all. Her teacher, Zyla Klobuchar, had warned her not to share her ironic assessment with her fatherman or any other steader, reminding her that seeds could be whipped for heresy if they mocked a patriarch. Uncle Greg, the prophet, used to say that Jefferson gave the nation the ability to gaze down from the mountaintop, but he neglected to teach it how to climb a hill. Gigi still wasn't exactly sure what the wizard meant by that, but she did know that the words Jefferson had written, words she'd memorized in legacy school, still thrilled her. His declaration of independence had put down roots in her head like a poem or a prayer. Even after she realized that the fair-skinned fathermen had failed to see how many of their flock were cooped up in the nation's cages. Jefferson's words made her heart sore. She would like to meet Thomas. She would ask the father man if his dimmer ghost seeds, his kin especially, slipped into his afterlife to haunt him. She suspected they did, and that even his beautiful words were not enough to appease them. One of the reasons why I wanted to write that particular passage was because I do think that for those of us who have feet kind of planted in two different worlds, often we can see the beauty in the other worlds. So Jefferson's words are beautiful, and we should all acknowledge that. But it's also true that there's a terrible complexity that kind of lies underneath the surface, and that is something that Gigi Genevieve Nottingham, she goes by Gigi, realizes and is very troubled by. I wanted to read you this tiny passage from Flying the Coop because it's about black hair. And everyone who knows anything about black hair knows that we've often had a hard time with our hair. We've often been mocked for it. I remember when my mother was, she was a widow very early, and my mother took her 3 biracial children over to her friend's house. And the friend looked at one of us and said to my mother, "How do you get a comb through it anyway?" And it was so embarrassing because we were just sitting there and we knew how, well, we don't really get combed through our hair, but that's not the point. And then when my son came home, many, many years later after I had a child, and he was 5 years old, and he was putting his hair down in front of the mirror, and I said, "Joseph, what are you doing?" And he said, "The children at school say my hair will never grow down like theirs does. It grows up." Which of course it grows up. And I said, "Don't you realize it's applauding? It's standing up and applauding? It's incredibly strong. It cannot be defeated." And then I wrote a poem that I've since read so many times about black hair, that was really for him a celebratory poem about how wonderfully robust and disobedient black hair can be. So this is a character called Tiro, and he too is a mule seed, and he's also something called a fly boy. He flies in the dream coop, and the dream coop is this huge arena-sized cage. And inside the cage, there are trampolines, there's a big wheel, there's all kinds of wonderful technical devices. Xboxes they're called, there's Douglas pipes, there's all kinds of things, Kingsmen, all named after people who were really prominent in the civil rights movement and afterwards. There's Rosa Parks perches where you can sit to rest between battles because you have to fight. So he's a flyboy, and he is a member of the Dream Fleet. And he's still mourning the death of his brother who was executed. And he's sitting in the fly coop in DC, which is known to seeds as Dream City. That's where they want to go, Dream City, because it's a liberty city and they can be free there. And he's just thinking about black hair. Not for the first time, Tiro wished his skin was as dark as Coop Master Nelson's, Coach Billy's, or Afari's, or at least a deep earthy brown like his Uncle Dreg's or Silaku's. G's skin tone, even though hers wasn't quite as dark as her man's or his uncle's, would be okay too. Gigi was a lot darker than he was, which made her complexion closer to where he wanted to be. If he was darker, people wouldn't be surprised when he claimed to teppy blood from the cradle of Africa. His hair was real curly and stand-upish, but not nappy enough for his taste. He loved the feel of nappy and frizzy and wiry. His hair was a tad too soft, too tameable. It yielded to the pick too easy. Black hair should tell the comb who's boss. As a seedling, he'd sit on his great-uncle's lap and plunge his chubby little fingers into the wizard's hair and love the soft, tangled feel of it. Felt like unsticky cotton candy in his hands. How could anyone not love that to pieces? I always like to read that when I'm with an audience of young children, some of whom have been mocked quite mercilessly about their hair, which really seems like a shame. And I do think we need to rethink some of our ads for Pantene and others when they say things like glossy and, well, or maybe not. Maybe it's fine. Maybe frizzy is good. And you often have those before pictures that look like some of us usually look, and then the after pictures where all the hair is smoothed out and tame. And I think we need to change that around. That's my opinion. I also wanted to read, let me see, actually, I think I'll just start this and nothing more than that, because I want to make sure we've got lots of time just to chat. And this part is, it takes place in DC, and Gigi has longed for years to visit the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And it's survived. It survived the Second Civil War, which is simply called the sequel. It's still there. It's in a state of real disrepair, but it's there. She has been desperate to get there. So she persuades her friends to take her there so that she can see it. And this started when I read at the museum some years ago, and I read in the Oprah Winfrey Theatre. If you've been in there, you know what that is. And it was a really kind of wonderful occasion because we also toured the museum and just had an amazing time. And it always seemed to me, even before then, that this would be a great site for a kind of revolution to begin. As I say, this was written well before January 6th, but it had been something that had been worrying me for some time because it seemed as though the divisions in our culture were becoming more rather than less severe, and it worried me. And I wanted to make sure that I explored what could potentially happen if we didn't try to nip this in the bud and speak up for justice in the way that we need to. So, this is when some of the steaders, the white steaders, come in and they're all armed, and they're not meant to be armed in the city without having a license, but they are. Soon the trickle changed to a flood. Bearded steaders strode into the expansive atrium, some masked, some not. On their shirts, they wore the seal of the father city of Armistice. A bearded father man straddled a planting, brandishing a rifle in one upraised hand and an ear of corn in the other. Some carried long guns, others semi-automatic handguns. A few wore bag kangaroos, the grenade pouches guards wore in the territories. Others had simpler weapons, sticks or knives. None were searched, none questioned. Many of the men received warm greetings from the DC patrollers at the door. Gigi felt sick. I also think that some of the scenes in this book were influenced by the fact that I was at Virginia Tech during the mass shootings. And I actually tutored Cho because I was so worried about some of the things that he was saying and doing, and I didn't want him in the classroom. And I copied notes to people as much as I could. I called them up. I tried to alert them to the fact that he did seem to be very disturbed. He suffered from selective mutism and didn't speak, not since he was 3 years old, just 1 or 2 words. But I couldn't, in those days, it was very difficult to get people to imagine catastrophe. I think we're not very good in the US at imagining catastrophe. British people are much better at it. And I think that's because they've actually experienced so much catastrophe, quite frankly, and things have kind of gone downhill in Britain for some time, and so they really do understand just how disastrous it can be. But I think that I drew on that to some extent because I think I always felt so terrible that I was meant to be so eloquent, people would often say, and my eloquence didn't help in the end. I still wasn't able to persuade people. And so that kind of guilt that you carry after that is something that you have to kind of reconcile yourself to and somehow overcome. And I think that always writing novels is kind of a journey into the self. And so to some extent, I think that was the way it was for me. But I won't read any more because I want to hear from you and hear from Sarah.
That was lovely. And we give her you know, your reading of the invasion of the African American Museum of History and Culture, it brought chills to my neck and raised the hair on my arms because it was just so fascinating. If you haven't read this book, it is impossible to read that passage without seeing the footage that we've all seen playing over and over again. But on the subject of imagining catastrophe, which is really interesting, it's something I've been thinking about for a while with American dystopias in particular, that they've been critiqued for not acknowledging that the bad, scary futures that they posit actually draw quite heavily on BIPOC lived experiences. And with this series, you're writing into a tradition of Black visionary novelists like Toni Morrison and Beloved, and obviously Octavia Butler. And they were really writing from a clear-eyed understanding of our history. Can you talk about the process of thinking through this world before January 6th? Just being prescient about so many of these issues that have concerned you. I guess I'm curious what came first. Was it the world? Was it the characters? Was it something else?
It's funny. I'm not sure it's possible to know what comes first when you're writing. That very often it kind of all comes first in this rush. And so you might hear a voice saying something, or you might hear a character saying something. I know when I'm teaching my grad students, we have an MFA program at Virginia Tech, and one of the things sometimes we try to do is take various elements of a novel and see if we can just focus on those for a while. But it's actually contrary to the way we really think. We don't think in a compartmentalized way. I think you agree, Sarah, when we write. We very often have all kinds of things coming to us at the same time. But it's definitely true that I had a vision of, there are maps in the beginning of the book, and I drew the first two, I drew all three, but especially the first two, as though they were drawn by Jelly Bean Gigi Lottieu, as though she had drawn them. So she draws the planting, and then she also, Uncle Greg actually draws the second map, which is of Virginia. And I think that world I saw visually before I even saw it textually. That I knew that there would be a young girl sitting down, drawing a map, imaging a map that she was not meant to image. There are certain things in her society, in the middle of the country, in the South, it's very segregated, that you are not allowed to say, you are not allowed to acknowledge. And she went ahead, not only acknowledged it, but also drew it, which is a very, very daring thing to do. And so, in many ways, I think that image, especially as someone who's an artist who paints, came to me early. But there was also another character who came to me in the very beginning, whose name is Afara, and she comes from afar, which is why Gigi calls her Afara. She's not meant to have a name. It is illegal for outcasts, the lowest rung of the ladder, as it were, to have a name. So she's a serviceed, and you should never name serviceed any name at all except a number. So she's called 33H/437, and that's the only way she's meant to be addressed. But her friend, Gigi, decides that she's going to address her as Afara. That is going to be her name. And it becomes a way of acknowledging her humanity. And Afara is the character that most people, I think, like best in the book in many ways. And it's partly because she speaks in her own kind of language. So she'll say things like, "The moon is pretty moonlight tonight." And she will not try to explain those things because it's just the way she sees the world. And when she hears that there were people who landed on the moon many years ago, before all the chaos came to the US, she can't believe it. It seems like the most amazing thing that someone could actually land on the moon. And she figures that they must be very small, because how else could they do it? It's such a tiny thing. And which actually makes complete sense to me. But sometimes she would come out with things that would completely surprise me. I wouldn't expect that she was necessarily going to say it. You'll understand, Sarah, because you write fiction and you don't know what your characters are going to say before they say them. It's rather like real people. And they come out with things that sometimes they are shocking. And sometimes you say, "You can't say that." And they still go ahead and say, "That's just the way that it goes." And you have to let them. You have to let the rein be very loose, I think.
Sure. I have a bombastic character in my novel. It's a lot of fun to write too. I'll ask one more question, and then if you're stewing over something and you want to jump in, just stick your hand up. But you were talking about the process of naming, and Jelly Bean, Gigi, Afara gets her name. I noticed in your writing that there's something really uncompromising about the number of names that a phenomenon, or object, or a person can have, that there's almost layers of anonymity or code switching, really, that I become aware of later in the story whenever Gigi's talking shop at a TV station. And he's using sort of all this familiar verbiage that we have in the green room or credits roll, that Gigi has no idea what he's saying. And when she's talking about her world, to some extent, he has no idea what she's saying either. So I wonder if you could just talk a little bit more about this rich linguistic world and sort of the cultural considerations that you brought up in her writing the novel.
Yeah, I think we often forget how much our language tells us who we are. That almost always the words that we choose, from the names that we allow ourselves to give each other, to the verbs that we use, to the imperative modes, all kinds of things, help us to understand who we are as people. And in this particular world, particularly in the middle of the country that is very segregated, words have a tremendous importance because they must continue to reinforce the system that is in place. And on either side of the country, there are free states. So it's just the center of the country and the south that is really roiling with this terrible segregation. I think that as I was thinking about this, and I'm not sure even consciously thought about it, to tell you the truth, that in many ways, all of the kinds of restrictions and all of the kinds of prohibitions were put in place kind of automatically because of the system that was there. And it always seemed to me that it was incredibly important that some people be able to move out of that kind of system and look at it from the outside. And so again and again, that's what Gigi Jellybean Nottingham tries to do, and that's why she draws her map, because she wants people to see things as she sees it. And she believes that if people can see things the way you see it, then they will understand something about themselves. And I think that's incredibly true. I think it took me a long time to understand much about the US, to tell you the truth. I thought I did when I first came here many, many years ago. I thought it was easy to summarize the US. Of course it's not. Incredibly complex, incredibly difficult to kind of parse and to pull apart. And that's what you want it to be, in a way, because that means that the culture is rich and diverse and has all kinds of conflicting energies going on inside it, just as Britain does. And I love the fact that, in many ways, as I chart a path through this series, one of the things I'm trying to show is a world of increasing complexity. So we start very small on the planting, which is where Gigi has been raised, and where all of the seeds, or botanicals as they're classified, do the labor, and the steaders then are the ones who are in charge for the most part. And then gradually the world gets larger and larger, and she sees what is outside. And one of the most exciting places she goes to is when she goes to Monticello, and then she goes to DC, and she charts that path up through Virginia and begins to understand just how different the world is and how exciting, in a way, and troubled the world is. And in the final book, she'll be actually going back to the cradle, to Africa, where I've lived and taught for some years. And she's going to be discovering some other things that she never thought could possibly happen. I should mention that there is something in the middle of this book, the first book, that changes everything. And I won't say what it is, but it draws upon magical realism. It draws, I hope, upon science in some interesting ways. But it changes fundamentally everything that is going to happen in the rest of the books, and changes Jellybean Gigi Lotamule in ways she cannot possibly imagine. Yeah. Well, you could say, that's really nice. Yes, I think we're probably going to have to say, especially as the second book's out now, what can we do?
Well, if anyone wants to jump in with a question, do we have microphones for?
Yes. Okay. Is it working?
It is.
The characters sound very rich and deep, but the question I have is, do you need to read the first book before you read the second?
That is such a good question. Nobody's ever asked me that before. I just realized, except for my husband, do I need to read the first book? He didn't say that, he's going to kill me on it. Yeah.
I read the second one first, and I feel oriented, and I felt very entertained, and I couldn't put it down. And I think you do a very good job gracefully supplying the backstory. I mean, I feel like I had the ebook for the first book, and when there was something that I wasn't sure of, I could just search for it. Technology helps.
One of the things that I realize that I'm working on now is a glossary, so that it doesn't matter where you come into the novel, you'll just be able to look certain things up. But the glossary's going to be so long, and quite frankly, who has time to? I'm working full time. It's not very easy to do all this, and so we'll see. But I really would like to have on it, even if I just do it for myself and then put it online or something, because there's a real complexity to the world that I'm hoping people won't necessarily miss. And I do think that a glossary could help quite a lot with that kind of thing. It's interesting. You don't have to read the first one first, but because something so dramatic happens in the middle of the freedom race, if you don't read that, then you come in after that transformation has occurred. So something to think about. But hopefully I've explained it well enough that you don't need to know that.
There's a wonderful origin story at the beginning of book one, though, that I would hate for you to miss out on. Actually, while I have you on that one, I'll ask another question about that. I love books that draw on folk tales and other storytelling traditions, oral storytelling traditions. There's story cloths in this novel that's sort of a visual prompt for the stories. I wonder if you could share with the audience a little bit more about the flying African myth.
Yes, all through this book, I wanted to draw upon the idea of flying Africans. And of course, that's a kind of legend that has grown up over the years, over the centuries. It began to some extent when people were enslaved, and all of a sudden they would be seen rising up and flying away. And they didn't have wings, they just flew. And there's a book called The People Who Fly, and so on. Some of you are familiar with it. And lots of black people are actually familiar with that idea, that you can suddenly raise up. Your yearning is so great to escape captivity that you rise up and just fly. And I think that that's an amazing kind of myth, really, and something that I draw upon in this book to a large extent. So I think not that you have to know that necessarily, because there are lots of ways to interpret what happens here. You can interpret it as magical realism. You can interpret it as science gone a little crazy. There's all kinds of things that you can suggest about this world that make it kind of unfamiliar yet familiar at the same time. And I do think when we're in distress and when we're enslaved, our imaginations really kind of take off in ways that we can't possibly imagine. I grew up very poor, and there were all kinds of things that I was never used to, that I didn't have. So, like 3 good meals a day, for example, but those kinds of basic things that were not necessarily things that I expected to be given, because my father died when I was 5, and my mother was very poor, and it was not good, it wasn't fashionable at that time to be biracial, so she put up with a great deal. And I do think that helps when you've gone through things like that there are things that you begin to know about the world, about the instability of the world, and the fact that it can turn on a dime. Sometimes I think that people who haven't experienced poverty or those kinds of challenges forget just how precarious the world is. And that's something that Gigi knows in this book, that there's a terrible precariousness, that the world is kind of balanced on something that it can easily be toppled. And if it is, then look out, because it's going to be a free-for-all. I do think, when I first began this book, many years ago actually, I began this series, and it was incredibly difficult for me to convince people that there could potentially be a civil war in this country, and that certain sections of the country would break off from others. People said, what are you talking about? That's not going to happen. America, this is the US. It's not the case anymore. You don't have to convince anybody. Most people do think we're in a very precarious state, and that it could happen. And that therefore the best way to arm yourself is to imagine that it could, and then be prepared. And make sure that you know how to fight it if it should happen. And I think in some ways, I probably wrote this series not just in the midst of grief about what happened with the mass shootings at Virginia Tech, the 32 students killed, and the student that I tutored who had committed that heinous act, but also to try to come to terms with what I saw as a future if people didn't look carefully, listen carefully, and make sure that they were prepared, and educating people. And that's why for me education is always the thing that saves us. That you educate people so that they know that difference is traversable, that you can make that leap from one to another. So that when I look at all of you, I don't think, oh, there's a white person, or there's a black person, or there's a biracial person. I think, oh, I bet that person is interesting to get to know. It has led me into all kinds of problems at times, because I have overestimated the capacity of others for friendship. Especially when I was growing up, I was very disappointing. But I would rather be that way than not.
Your comments about education are a really powerful sentiment here at the Jefferson School as well. Are there other questions?
Lucinda, I think you partially were just speaking to this issue, but I'm always wondering, how do you come to decide you're going to write a dystopic novel versus any other kind of book?
That is such a good question. And in many ways, I resisted writing this novel. I thought at first that I was going to write a kind of young adult fiction book, which is what I wanted to do, a young adult novel, and it would have lots of jokes in, oh, it would be funny. They'd be on planting, but they'd still be funny. So I wrote the first version of the book as a young adult novel, because I just been through the shootings at Virginia Tech. There were things that I was grieving. I didn't want to enter a world that I thought might be very painful to enter. But then what happened, not only did the young adult attempts not work, but also the fact that I heard Gigi's voice, I heard Genevieve Nottingham's voice. And she was saying to me, write me, write me. And so I thought, okay, I'm going to risk it. And then little Afara came along, who at the beginning of the series is much younger and then gets older, of course, but she too had so much to say that was so different from what I thought was going to happen. And so I like to think that they, and a character called Uncle Dread, who's a kind of prophet, and very much in the tradition of Martin Luther King, he very early in the book has a huge role to play, and he is the carrier of stories. He is the storyteller. He passes these on, just as my father was a storyteller. My father was a novelist and also an artist, but to make ends meet, he worked in a Brillo factory. Brillo, everybody knows what Brillo is. Yeah. I always thought that was such a wonderful metaphor, because Brillo was so harsh and awful and it could take your skin off. And he worked there until he was fired, because he tried to start a union. My father was pretty naughty in all kinds of ways. So then he was fired and we were poor and clever. But one of the things that I really kind of liked about thinking about this book was the whole idea of writing about people who don't have voices, who aren't really allowed to speak. Then who speaks for them, and what do they say when they are allowed to speak? And for me, Gigi Jellybean's voice was the voice that I heard more than any of the others. That she was the one trying so hard to escape, to find her own way. But she was also torn because her mother's there on the planting. She's torn because she's a painter, she paints just as I do, and so she images this map of the planting that's in the beginning of the book, which in fact is one of the most dangerous things you can possibly do. You are never ever allowed to image a planting. If you do, then essentially you're giving away planting secrets, and that is something that the homesteaders who own the planting in the segregated section of the country will not allow you to do. So one of the things I found my way towards these characters, I think, by imagining what it would be like being Gigi, Jelly Bean Lottermule, and painting that man, drawing that man. What would that be like? What would I miss out? What would I say? How would I try to convey to people the horror of something that they have never experienced? And that yearning to communicate is something that I think that drives her often in all kinds of ways.
This radio here on me, and
Question about your writing process. So, after the initial attempt at a YA novel, did you envision the subsequent adult novel as being a trilogy, or did you think, like, at what point in your process did you realize this is going to be a trilogy? And sort of along those lines, are you more of a plotter or a pantser in terms of your writing style?
You write, right?
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I do. Oh dear. It's so difficult when you start to write something because you never really know, you must know this, you never really know how it's going to shape itself. And it has a mind of its own, it's organic. So it starts to grow in a certain way and then it takes off in ways you could never possibly imagine. So if I had charted out every chapter of these novels and thought of it as a trilogy, I don't think I would have started it necessarily. Instead, I thought of it as one book, and I tried to trust the voices who were speaking to me. And they really do speak to me. Like, I don't invent the voice for Gigi Lottermule. I didn't invent the voice for Afara, or for Uncle Dreg, or for any of the characters in this book. They spoke to me, and then I jotted down what they said, which is why it always seems, you might feel the same way, Sarah, it seems a bit like cheating, to write, because in many ways, you really are a kind of medium, and you're just listening and hoping that those voices will speak to you and they'll lead you through to this new place. You know what I mean by that, right? When you write, is that the same kind of way?
Right. My initial thought about the novel was it morphs and changes over time, and layers get added to it over time. So they're like three drafts at this point. I think it's much better, but I don't know beginning the shape that it would end up taking.
I so much understand that. My first novel I wrote was called Lady Roses many years ago, and I threw out 1,000 pages. 1,000 pages gone. And I didn't have time, I was working, I was a single parent, it was very difficult. But I knew that it wasn't working in the way that I'd hoped, and so I had to throw it out and start. And I just started I kept 3 pages of the 1,000, and the rest. And I realized why that was. I was a poet, and I was coming at fiction for the first time. And nobody had really taught me how to write fiction. So I found my way through the story by finding the characters. And sometimes, how it takes, like, Sarah and I have only just met, and I'll get to know her, I hope, in the future so much better. And we're kind of finding our way towards each other right now. And it's exactly the same as when you're writing a novel. You find your way towards the characters, and then you hope they're going to start to talk to you. And sometimes they're really stubborn and they won't do it. And other times they're just wonderful and they can open their arms and say, oh yes, just write me. And then at some point, when things kind of click, then the novel writes itself. I think you would agree with that, would you?
It's rocky, it's up and down, stop and go. Maybe forget to take the emergency brake off sometimes. And a similar question though, sort of the other end of the creative process is your acknowledgements you had thanked your editor for sort of helping you with some of the inventions. Can you talk about some of the changes that you made or lessons learned or anything that made you good for our own manuscripts?
I have this wonderful editor called Jen Gunnels, Dr. Jen Gunnels, and she was in academia and now she's an editor, and she's really really smart and sassy and kind of rude about things and irreverent, and I love her. And she often will really just say, well, this is terrible, if I send her a chapter or chapters that she doesn't like. And I really do appreciate that she just tells me the truth about how she's thinking about things. But in many ways, the novel really kind of evolved on its own and kind of developed on its own in ways that surprised me. So, as I was saying, there were certain characters that I listened to very much. So, Jelly Bean, Gigi, Lotta Mule, I listened to all the time, and also Afara. And it was those two characters that were like, you know, the lighthouses in the novel that would lead me through. You must find that with the characters of yours, that there are often characters that speak to you so much that you know that as long as you keep listening to them and you hear their voices, then they're probably going to steer you. They're the lighthouse characters, they really are. And they will take you to a place that you most want to go. Now, I forgot what the rest of the question was. What did you say?
Well, it sounds like you were setting chapters as you were writing. I mean, what kinds of suggestions did she offer? Were there any sort of lessons that you can apply to book 3 or other trilogies in the future?
Now, the first book was taken, completed, but then I rewrote certain sections. Second book, kind of a mixture of both things. I drafted part of it and then got some feedback and then changed some things and drafted some more. In many ways, it is wonderful to have an editor that you trust. That you feel as though she is going to tell you the hard truths all the time and not shirk from them. It's also very difficult, as everyone knows the famous saying, very hard to kill your darlings. And it is. And there are things, I'm always talking with my students about that, who are novelists. When do you say, this character just isn't working? She needs to leave. You know, I have to leave her behind. What a terrible thing to have to say. But sometimes it's so important that you do that, because otherwise you are really threatening your whole novel, and you really don't want that to happen. I actually think for some novelists, and I'm like this, I kind of have to see the whole arc of the story before I really know where the characters are going. I do know some novelists who are friends of mine who just see it chapter by chapter, but that's not the way that I do things. I definitely have to see the whole narrative arc.
Any other questions out there?
First of all, congratulations on creating a very fascinating plot, and it sounds like you're allowing the characters to develop themselves. And but my question is, obviously you're writing about something that's supposed to be taking place in the future, but as we can see, it's also the past and the present too. So I was just wondering, how much, as percentage of time-wise, would you say that you spend looking at the historical context of what you're writing?
That's a fascinating question. I've never got that question before. Well done. You know, it's such a mixture in this book of past, present, and future. So the book opens, the whole trilogy opens with the legend of the bird tribe and what that meant to a particular tribe called the Tetepi tribe that is actually made up. But a Tetepi tribe that Uncle Dre, the prophet, is part of, what the fact that they could fly meant to other people who were their descendants. And so, of course, at the very beginning, therefore, he tells that story. And he tells this wonderful, kind of enlightening story about how they took off and they had wings and they flew, and it was just an amazing thing. But there was a lot of jealousy, and people wanted to hold them to the ground. And some tribes were really angry, and there was a kind of war. And so in the very first chapter, you hear about that long distant past that in fact has perhaps, we later learn, been carried on into the future. And so I did think that what I wanted to do was marry history with science. Is there a way to do that? So I hope that by the time readers get to the end of the trilogy, as I say, I'm working on the bird tribe right now, which is the third book, I hope they will say something like, I think the truth could be this, or indeed it could be this, or maybe it could be that. That in fact, I hope I'm celebrating story and narrative so much that could be the kind of embedded solution to this mystery. Or it could be genetics, it could be science, it could be discovery. That I want to leave those openings for the past, the present, and the future to come together in a way that I actually do feel our lives come together. One of the things that always helped me through poverty when I was growing up was the stories that my father had told. He was a really great storyteller, and he had 2 novels published, and a wonderful artist too. And so I would look at some of his paintings, or I would read some of his stories, and I would think, oh, there is such wonder in the world. It may be that we don't have a heating in the house, and it may be that it's really, really difficult being a biracial child in 60s England. But oh my goodness, what wonder there is if you just turn the page a little or step outside of your own circumstance, and then what you can find. And I know that you must feel the same way when you're writing, that in many ways you become these different characters. And what a privilege that is. I've often thought that I would be totally insane without that. That in many ways it allows me, especially after the shootings to be honest, when despair was something that I waged war with all the time, because I felt I should have been able to stop it and I couldn't. Knowing that I could enter and become a completely different character in a completely different time was something that was incredibly comforting and liberating. And I do think, I often say to my students that writing is the greatest antidote, the imagination is the greatest antidote we have to despair. And I do believe that if we nurture our imaginations in ways that are important, there are things that we are able to do and able to see and able to understand that we could never do otherwise. So even when I was teaching in Africa and there were very, very poor children there, if they had an imagination, often they would make it. But they wouldn't if they didn't. Because you have to be able to imagine a state other than where you are. And again, I think characters in the Freedom Race and Fly the Coop and the last one, the Bird Tribe, are all imagining otherness, or imagining difference. And sometimes I think that's what all of us need to do, that if we were able to just imagine otherness enough, then there wouldn't be the kind of racial tension that we're living through. And there wouldn't be that kind of gender tension either. There'd be all kinds of things that wouldn't exist because we would have made an empathic leap into otherness. And how great that is. And that's what we ought to be nurturing, not I think, become smaller and smaller and more closed off to difference, but instead more and more open. And that's something that we as teachers, I think, need to do.
I agree with that 100%. I mean, I think of a long time in an event, someone asked me, what is the purpose of fiction? And I really wasn't sure how to answer it on the spot, but I think in the years after, it's practicing other ways of thinking and feeling. You-centered climate change is one of the causes of this world that you write. And, writers, storytellers, art makers of all kinds just have a role in that, helping people imagine a future. How do we survive? That's one of the things I appreciate so much about your mission here. Are there any other questions?
I was interested in your explanation of discovering the arc as you write your story. And it relates back to the trilogy decision. Decided making that, there were decisions you made to define that arc, right? There were storylines you chose not to go because this is their choice of the story. Was it at that point that you started to say, oh, I've got some things here that I'm putting to the side that I have to, but there's enough story there that's going to become my second book? Or is that something at the end you said, oh, there's a lot here I got to do that we want to do the second part of the trilogy?
That's a great book. Do you write as well? University of Richmond? Yes?
Yes.
Oh, yes. I got my honorary doctorate from the University of Richmond when I gave commencement degrees. Yeah, it was so great, so much fun. I love getting an honorary doctorate because you don't have to do anything. I did think of it as a trilogy. Not in the very beginning, because I thought it was just going to be a young adult book. I don't mean just in that sense that I don't expect young adult. I love young adult writing, but I thought it would be fairly short. And in fact, I wrote the first draft and it was about 400 or 500 pages. And I thought that that would be the whole book, and I tried to squeeze a lot of what I now got in book 2 and book 3 into that last half. And my agent said, you know, Lucinda, I think you probably want to end it much earlier so that you can go into a bit more detail and then continue it. And I thought, I don't want to write more books. It's so hard to write just the one. I don't want to have to do it again. And I hadn't written novels before. I know how much they take out of you. They're really hard. But she was so right. So this first book ends in a way that I thought would be about 2/3 of the way through the book, the first book. But in fact, no, it did need to be the ending. And it freed me up after she said that, because there was so much that then I could develop. I felt as though I'd been in a little closet, and then somebody had opened the door and said, run around the room, run around the room. And it was a wonderful thing to be able to do, to see how complex that world could be. So even though I didn't know originally necessarily that it was going to be a trilogy, I can't imagine it now unless it were a trilogy. But having said that, I would not, again, advise anyone to do a trilogy ever, because it really is hard. And my poor husband, who's probably sleeping back there because he's so exhausted, knows just how awful it is to live with someone who is writing a trilogy. My students I asked them to write a short story. This was last year, I think, and I don't think it was my graduate class, I think it was one of my undergraduate classes, and they had this character that they invented called something like Professor Royal, who was very similar to Professor Roy, of course, and she was going around kind of just going crazy saying, never write a trilogy, never write a trilogy. And it's funny how suddenly your students can hold up a mirror to your face and think, oh my, do I really sound like that? And the thing was, yes, I knew I did really sound like that. It was very, very worrying. The only thing I would say to anyone who wants to write a trilogy is just have a real sense of humor. Know that things are going to go horribly wrong, and just be patient with yourself and love yourself as much as you can. And then marry Larry, because that's my husband. He's a really good editor, junior editor, I thought.
Well, we're so glad that you wrote this trilogy. It was a pleasure to meet you through your words and then here in person. And I'm so glad that you spent this hour with us. One last note of housekeeping. There is a signing table in that beautiful gallery over there where Lucinda will be signing books. And again, if you see a QR code for a survey, I know some people would be really happy if you filled out that survey.
The books are in this room, and the signing is in that room.
Gotcha. So if
You want to buy books, go there and then go there.
yes, so you can buy a book and then have it signed. And so thank you for your time, and